Nice. Perfect. So my presentation is titled Here to Stay, the Generational Narrative and the Long March of the Chilean Student Movement from 2006 to 2015 for Transforming Education on the Ground. The main aim of this presentation is to discuss some of my findings. I think that we have a problem there. Yeah. Can you hear me?
Okay, now.
Yeah. So the aim of my research is to discuss some of the findings, in particular in this presentation, regarding how the generational narrative circulates around how former activists of the Chilean movement carry their visions of educational transformation to their current practices in education and in social movements. So even though a relevant part of my thesis is related with education and critical pedagogy, I will say that this string of findings are much more related with social movements and generational thinking and narratives. So just to give you a spoiler about the presentation. Specifically, drawing in on my 10 months of ethnographic fieldwork, in this presentation, I will analyze the generational narrative's role in how former activists carry visions. Specifically, I will discuss three main findings or elements to have discussions. That is, first, how the generational narratives operates to read current fields of conflict while engaging in pedagogical and social struggles in education. Second, to organize and develop specific repertoires of action for current struggles for defending or expanding public education. And the third one is how this generational narrative fuels continuous engagements with social, cultural, and political projects to transform Chilean education and society. My research project, in general, my research project is focusing on understanding the significance of the Chilean student movement for education, for educational transformation, and for societal transformation on the long term. Why I did this study is because I have a motivation for understanding the significance of the movement beyond the peak of mobilizations on the long term, beyond the idea of influence on educational policies, and particularly trying to understanding the significance on the ground, and at the same time to explore beyond institutional spaces of politics. Because of the current developments in Chile, the idea of the impact of the Chilean student movement and the idea of former activists is quite related with the entering in politics, in traditional politics, creating political parties, entering into the government, becoming president. So because of that, I think at the same time, I try to understand this on the ground in specific spaces. For doing that, I explore former CSM activists that are activists of the Chilean student movement, their visions and practices. And with this, I'm trying to enter in the conversation about the consequences and the different trajectories that the movements from the starts of the 20s, from the beginning of this century, created, and with what consequences and for whom. The Chilean student movement between 2006 and 2015 was a social movement spanning nearly a decade and was characterized by its cyclical nature, reflected in a series of mobilizations both at the national and local levels. It involved periods of intense protest, alternating with phases of lower activity. Throughout the cycle of this movement, all these waves share a common goal: to stop segregation and inequality in the Chilean educational system. This objective involved countering privatization processes implemented during the dictatorship, perceived by the student movement as the underlying cause of the barriers hindering equal access to education. In 2006, the student movement surged massively and coordinatedly at the national level, led by high school students. Disputes then moved to schools and universities at the local and regional level, reaching a new peak of intensity with the massive protests in 2011 and with less force in 2012. In the final stage of this cycle, students use their common political frame focused on educational inequality to contest the policy design process created by political parties in response to the movement demands until 2015. Following this series of protests with common elements, I suggest that the beginning of a new cycle that is much more connected with the feminist student movement, and recently the student struggles has been recontextualized within the social uprising that began in 2019. Recent research on the short-term educational consequences of the Chilean student movement has evidenced its influence on educational policy and on raising awareness about the relevance of schools for social movements organization. Furthermore, studies exploring the political consequences of the Chilean student movement in broader society suggest that the movement prompted the emergence of new narratives about the Chilean socioeconomic model and of new political individuals or organizations contesting the neoliberal system. These approaches have been key to raise awareness about the political, sociological, and educational relevance of the student movement. However, neither of those studies has explored to what extent the educational transformations demanded by the Chilean student movement have reshaped the everyday lives of schools in the long term. To tackle this challenge, my research focuses on the long march of the student movement by examining the trajectories of its former activists. This approach aims to understand how the demanded educational transformation materialized in the long term within the daily life of schools. I explore the strategies and processes that unfold after the schools are no longer occupied. To gain inspiration, I traveled back to the 60s, a time of student movements and reflective processes that analyzed their potential limitations. In October 1968, the political and cultural magazine Black Dwarf published a column by West German student activist called Rudi Dutschke titled Students and Capitalism. Influenced by Gramsci's War of Positions and drawing on Chinese Revolution terminology, Dutschke advocated extending student mobilizations into new civil society spaces, leveling this process as a long march through the institutions. His focus wasn't on immediate outcomes, but on a strategy for transferring social transformation from student conflicts to new horizons. My study, inspired by Tarlot's appropriation of Dutschke concept, suggests a track to explore the long marches of social movements, but apply to the student movement unique research challenges. The temporal nature of a student movement tied to graduation hinders sustained participation. And basically, as a researcher, I cannot follow a movement that already ended. Furthermore, the Chilean student movement horizontal structure complicates sustaining a rigid organizational setup. Which of the organizations should I follow if I decide to follow an organization? Therefore, my research suggests exploring less formalized long march forms, analyzing former activist vision and practices for building an understanding of the movement's impact over time. This literature suggests that their lasting impact in activist worldviews and skills transferred to new social movement and spaces. That literature comes particularly for social movement studies, and it's called biographical consequences. What I mean with former activist visions of educational transformation. I define this vision as the narratives crafted by former activists in connections with the previous involvement in the CSM. Specifically, these former CSM activist narrative productions are crafted around the imaginaries, discourses, and social movement frames experienced during their participation in the student movement, and which, according to them, are shaping and now influencing their current ideas and practice as in-service teachers in education. This approach allows me for an exploration of those personal journeys of former CSM activists within the movement, analyzing both individual and collective experiences. Using a narrative theoretical framework, I argue that their visions are developed indirectly and subjectively. The proposed analytical approach moves beyond the idea of a linear past, present, future framework commonly associated with biographical outcomes in social movement studies. Instead, I suggest exploring and interpreting these narratives as reconstructions from the present by former CSM activists now working as teachers. Operationally, in my research, vision referred to those moments in the lives narratives of these activists, specifically these moments when they connect their current and future practices with the frameworks and experiences of within the student movement. It's important to note that the term vision might suggest an association with observation, and indeed, observation is deeply intertwined with the concept as operate of a way of framing social reality that at the same time is profoundly narrative. Considering the relevance of the idea of former CSM activists, I consider that it's important at the same time to discuss a little bit what is the role of former CSM activists currently in Chile. Chile experienced a significant change in the last 3 decades with neoliberal policies and export-led growth leading to economic expansion and reduced poverty. However, that persistent incoming inequality has made Chile one of the most unequal OECD countries, impacting equal access to education, health, and housing, between others. As a consequence, during the last 15 years, several social movements emerged, fueled by social discontent and demands for greater equality. In a certain way, some researchers have claimed the idea that Chile became a social movement society where social movements were able to replace the radical imagination that during the 20th century was mainly a role of the political left. So basically now social movements now are producing ideas about social reality that are fostered and circulate in society. In this context, thanks to their massive mobilizations, former student activists have gained notable recognition. Drawing on Walter Benjamin's concept of the social figure, I suggest that the concept of former CSM activist serves as an identity narrative embodying specific characteristics and social positions shaped by their socio-historical context. This, according to different research, for example, I think Manuel Canales research in Universidad de Chile, this is a highly educated cohort, but despite benefiting from the neoliberal growth, face persistent inequality and isolation. At the same time, they represent the first cohort in Chile not to experience the dictatorship. Former CSM activists, initially prominent in student mobilizations, gain a recognition in politics. Transitioning from mobilizations to institutional roles, they contributed to create the Student Caucus in the 2014 elections and the establishment of new political parties in 2017. Currently, a former CSM activist holds the presidency in Chile, and former CSM activists are often depicted as architects of a new left, distinct from historical leftist movements. This trajectory has inspired hopes for left institutional politics. For instance, in this quote from Jorge Arrate, that he was Ministry of Salvador Allende government, he is a socialist, he suggests that this generation of former activists has never been before. In Chile, there has never been before a generational phenomenon with the strength and impact that this one has. If I compare them with my generation at the same age, I think they have a better capacity and extraordinary power of analysis and articulation, but has also at times been construed as a potential source of societal radicalization. Basically, former CSM activists also has been portrayed as a source of social radicalization by certain media outlets. For instance, here, this media outlet is the most popular in the country. He is the owner of and he has a column weekly. And in this column, he said, in one of these columns, he said, the current revolution happening in Chile, that he called revolution to the social upheaval in 2019, is generational and ideological. What has happened is a systematic task of deconstruction in the country, carried out, among others, by enormous number of idealized young teachers. So basically, we have these different narratives around former activists and a generation. In one sense, you have these ideas coming from the left, but at the same time, you have some groups that are claiming that these groups are radical and they are trying to develop and deconstruct the traditions in Chile. So for trying to explore how I develop a methodology to answer these questions regarding the visions and practices of former CSM activists. For this study, I designed a methodology that combines narrative and ethnographic elements to address the challenge of exploring the long march of the Chilean student movement. Over 10 months, I listened to and accompanied former activists of the student movement, now teachers, in their daily lives, both in schools and in spaces of social movements in the Great Concepcion, Chile. As such, I went beyond only analyzing narratives as texts or as stories in a social vacuum. I examined their interaction with social practices, power relations, and influence on the culture and social reality of the context in which they operate. I structured this narrative ethnographic combination in 3 phases with specific objectives and actions. In the stage one that I call exploration and mapping the territory, I gather information focusing on educators transforming education, former student activists and advocates of the student movement. Mapping identified their active roles in union campaigns, efforts for social justice in school. Identification relied heavily on press and social media, but I have to recognize that my role as teacher and former activist also facilitated a network access for mapping these activists to educators. In the stage 2, that I call narratives and educational and political practices of former movement activists, I developed life stories of 24 former activists, now teachers, which were interviewed using theoretical sampling. Narrative interviews explored the perspectives on educational transformation and the connection to the Chileans to the movement. Topics included professional trajectories, commitment to change, views on student involvement, and current participation in social movements. The stage concluded with a map of diverse visions and practices guiding case selection for the next research phase. In the stage 3, that I call intensive immersion, I immerse myself in educational and social settings, social movement settings, shadowing 6 former student movement activists to understand their daily or how they carry these visions to their current practices. Data collection involved participant observation, ethnographic interviews, and the immersion ranged between 3 weeks to 2 months per activist, where I participated as a student teacher, supported classroom, attended meetings, documented activities, and engaged in demonstrations. Additionally, with their consent, I analyzed their lives on social media, providing further insights. So as I told you, that from this theoretical and methodological device that I developed, that is my thesis, I realized that one of the main concepts circulating around the process of they bringing visions to the current context and developing into practices was the idea of generation. In my research, I found that when describing and putting visions of educational transformation into practice, one of the most important concepts circulating was the idea of generation. The generational concept is key in shaping their visions of social equality, education, transformation, and democracy in schools and social movements, highlighting challenges within institutions. Despite the significance of the generation concepts in social sciences for explaining social change, my research shift focused from finding generations to understanding its role and function in constructing transformative visions for education rooted in the CSM experiences and applied to the present. So basically, rather than looking to claim the idea that I found a generation operating in social life, I'm trying to understand how the narrative operates within this process that I'm focused on understanding. While the generational narratives of former CSM activists might resonate with what Mannheim coined as generational units, the focus of my thesis centers about in what ways the narrative will a specific generational narrative or conscious. This way of articulating a narrative suggests an element of historicity, which provides a subjective lens to look at social time. As such, those narratives connect their lifetimes and daily experience with certain proximity or distance from other generational cohorts, making intergenerational relations a domain for interpreting social reality. The first finding that I will discuss is the idea of generational belonging, the idea of generational consciousness feeling continuous engagements with educational and social transformation. Within the study narratives, the vision of educational transformation emerged as a key in shaping a sense of belonging to a collective entity, the student generation. In doing so, the narratives intertwine generational elements with the transformative ones, with the latter explicitly becoming the moral cornerstone for generational belonging and the basis for problematizing societal realities through age-based criteria. The vision of educational transformation is crafted always in connection with this collective identity, forefronting age-related issues. For instance, in this quote that you have in your front from Fernanda, she's claiming the idea that it's a generation that come to shake things up. So rather in my study, rather than finding really structured ideas or agendas about how they bring education or transformation to education, is much more forefronted in this quite a fluid concept. It's much more related with this idea of floating signifiers from people like Stuart Hall or Ernest Laclau. So basically, there is this idea that people is trying to transform things, but the most important thing is that this transformation allows you to create this idea of a generation. During my interviews with former CSM activists, most of them used the concept of generation to describe a political identity, a particular group of us tied to a group of visions of educational transformation produced from the context of the CSM and carried to their current times and roles. Fernanda's narrative underscores the concept of generation as a collective characterized by age and the shared experience of involvement in the student movement. While there are flexible boundaries concerning age within this group, its members predominantly identify themselves as young teachers. These dual elements shape the distinctive features of former CSM activist generational conscious, and the current president, as is said here in the quote, is perhaps one of the examples of those circulating around society right now. Life stories also illustrate how narratives about generational identity, as constructed by former activists, tend to generalize commitment to transformation in education. In this narrative, an entire generation is often illustrated as having a consistent drive for educational transformation. In doing so, it also essentializes some political values based on age, being young, and experience, being a former activist. The generalization and essentialization of the transformative aspects in defining the generation highlights that the vision of transformations plays a specific role in narratives about the generational aspects of former CSM activists. It serves as a requirement for producing a sense of belonging to this generation. As Alejandra suggests here, for example, we can find the idea that this generational shift, the idea that there is a generation that is shaping things and that generation is committed. So basically you have that border where the concept of transformation, rather than signifying something to change things, is defining a particular identity. Narratively, Alejandra's story provides a clear example of how collective sense of identity, specifically that of a generation, operates. In discussing the concept of generation, Alejandra transitions from speaking in the first person, I, to a collective perspective, we. She, in a part, she even includes me in the conversation. And in this part, what she said, I believe that public education is going to change, Pablo. And I'm not sure that I'm convinced. I am very committed to that. I think those of us who were part of the CSM generation. So she's including me in the narration of this change. Former CSM activists like Fernanda and Alejandra reveal in interviews that generational consciousness fuels enduring commitments to social justice. The flexible and open cohesion within this collective identity contributes to sustaining long-term visions of educational transformation, especially among in-service teachers. However, challenges arise from tendencies toward generalization and essentialization within this generational consciousness, impacting the translation of CSM experience into ongoing social justice efforts. That connects with my second finding, that is how the generational narrative is used to describe, organize, and develop specific repertoires of actions for current struggles for defending or expanding public education. During the protest organized by teachers in the commune of Talcahuano, during the second semester of 2022, I had the opportunity to meet with former activists of the student movement in the Greater Concepcion area. These protests occur in different waves, addressing various issues, but with the common slogan of defending public education. During one of these protests, I followed Francisco, a history teacher in secondary education and an active member of the student movement from 2006 to 2015, who was one of the local teachers' union coordinators for a period of 2 months. Before working alongside Francisco, I had the opportunity to learn about his life story related to education in 3 sessions. In these conversations, Francisco already emphasized the presence of a certain distinctive political action repertoires of his generation. For instance, in this quote, Francisco organized the narrative around the years 2006 and 2011. He drew those years as spaces for these experiences for this generation. And from there, from that part, he moves to describe the different political tools and capacities that they develop because of their experience within the CSM. So he described the idea that youth or the generation that took part in the CSM, now they are teachers, they can take certain risks in contrast with all teachers. At the end, he says something like, the learning within the student movement allow us to unfold ourselves differently and also in terms of increased participation and democracy. So basically, the specific repertoires of political action and political organization are connected with the idea of generation that at the same time represent this experience of being part of the student movement. In 2022, in November 2022, Francisco led me to a well-organized teachers' union assembly in Talcahuano, breaking from tradition of doing Concepcion, as they wanted to support Talcahuano mobilizations. The day started with a communal breakfast, symbolizing unity. I had the opportunity to sit with Francisco and have a short talk. These are ethnographic notes that I have from that talk and that moment. During our conversation, Francisco delves into the details of the ongoing mobilization, sparking a broader discussion on the various movements they have undertaken in recent years. Sorry? Francisco elaborated on the different elements, highlighting the significance of this new generation of teachers emerging from the student movement for the mobilization of educators, even referring to a front page in a local paper, that is that picture. He shared insights into the diverse actions that they orchestrated, ranging from occupying municipal buildings to direct protest actions, such as street interruptions activities. Activities I had actively documented a week ago, capturing the involvement of young teachers who were previously activists in the student movement. Francisco also suggested the necessity to adapt to new times and roles as educators. He humorously noted that many of the direct actions, especially those that occurred in the past, have been replaced by more symbolic protests, like the planned disruption of the oncoming event. He emphasized that my role during this action will be to capture, photograph, and document the interruption. You are seeing a picture of that interruption. Francisco circles back to underscore the importance of having teachers who were part of the student movement, expressing that these individuals are more inclined to engage in such actions while receiving support from their more senior colleagues. Representatives arrived, sharing individual journeys during an informal prelude to the assembly. The shift in breakfast marks the assembly start. About 40 minutes, Francisco makes me a sign, it's time to go to the protest. During our work, I observed the age of the attendees, the specific activists that were leading to interrupt the celebration that they were interrupting. I recall previous interviews, recognizing that a significant portion actively involved in this specific action are former activists in the student movement. Upon arrival, the teachers unfurled a banner advocating for the defense of public education in Talcahuano, abruptly halting a march coordinated and led by Chilean carabineros, that is the police in Chile. In this ethnographic narrative, the recurring theme of a generation significantly contributes to understanding teacher mobilization dynamics. Francisco introduced a new generation of teachers from the student movement, emphasizing their pivotal role in ongoing mobilization. Personal narratives detailing actions and strategies embody and contextualize the concept. Francisco's tone and humor highlight the adaptability of the generational dynamics. Observing protest participants, diverse ages are noted, but a significant portion of them are former student activists, reinforcing the concept relevance. The narrative culminates in a protest where the new generation of teachers interrupt a coordinated event. And the last finding is that how the generational consciousness and narrative help former system activists to read current fields of conflict while they are trying to develop transformations in schools. In my interviews, I gain insight into the intergenerational conflict as a critical factor in understanding current educational transformations. This discussion enabled me to grasp former system activists' much broader interpretation of the concept of their generation. For instance, this is an interview that I made to Richard. Through interviews, I explore intergenerational conflict as a key factor in understanding the current educational transformations. Richard's perspective highlighted the impact of living during the dictatorship. So in this narrative, Richard claims and highlights the relevance of the Chilean student movement as a space for the construction of a project of educational transformation. Then he moves to explain how that experience that a generation had in that movement, it's moved to the current teachers movement. Specifically, he speaks about the idea of a student generation creating spaces to develop a new education. Yeah. So, and at the end, he claimed this idea that the current student generation is highly committed to the struggle, which is reflected in the change of union delegates in schools, as now in Coronel, for example. So this idea that a new generation of activists is entering in teachers' organizations and changing that with transformative purposes. This connection, this idea of In many of the interviews, they claim the idea that they bring the idea of a new education in contrast with what they call demandas gremiales, that is, demands connected with just salary and more resources for teachers. And at the same time that they share this narrative of a new generation bringing transformation to the present thanks to their experiences on the movement, they have a narrative about all generations. So basically, they create this distinction between old teachers and young teachers. In this, for instance, here Richard emphasized that the experience of living under the dictatorship significantly shaped the characteristics and attitudes of each generation. Those who experience the period of repression and fear tend to be more cautious and less mobilized in their commitment to change. Conversely, young teachers who did not directly experience the dictatorship demonstrate a greater willingness and commitment to drive or support educational transformations, particularly the generation of the student movement. Consequently, the generation concept takes on a broader dimension, encompassing those with similar characteristics and perspectives due to their historical context, even if they did not participate directly in the CSM. Drawing on the idea of Artes, this narrative creates an opposition, I think, excluding older individuals without student activism experience from being seen as transformatives in education. This ageism that Molly discussed in 2005 reveals an essentialization of political visions based on ages in these narratives. And I think that is an output, a kind of narrative that is really important to start to discuss, particularly when we speak about student movements. Final comments. In adapting a narrative approach, the generation vision emerged as a crucial and flexible narrative, helping to sustain the visions of the Chilean student movement. Drawing from Pauleta, the student movement generation narrative seems like a product of the CSM that at the same time is used to continue and pursue the commitment to transform education on the long term. These narratives and experiences reflect an open generational narrative, facilitating the integration of new teachers into existing school and extending its reach. During my participant observation, I realized that the idea of being young and being of this generation moved within CSM experiences and at the same time included people that just shared the same time, but that these people didn't have enough information to say that they were part of the movement or not. So the CSM generation narrative provides a flexible framework for organizing experiences, holding advantages in sustaining transformative approaches. Research suggests that flexible narratives have greater potential to mobilize individuals than fixed ones. As emphasized by Haven, narratives plays a crucial role in reproducing social struggles and sustaining the radical imagination of social movements. Former CSM activists' generational experiences serves as a foundation for sustaining and expanding CSM-inspired visions and practices, driving long-term educational transformations. Despite these productive elements, I argue that are many other elements that are need to be discussed, as this narrative alone may not be sufficient for escalating transformation over time. The first one is the challenges of essentialization in transformative narratives. It is important to address the challenges that the essentialization of transformation places on these narratives of generational consciousness. As shown in different former activist narratives, assuming a commitment to transformation does not inherently produce a collective articulation of transformative projects that lead to operationalizing social justice into specific actions on the everyday. Therefore, former activists may perceive their actions as transformative, often neglecting the significance of committing to the daily effort required to create opportunities for localized change. This is particularly concerning when it comes to the generalization or to the generational aspect. If the whole generation is seen as naturally transformative and shares a commitment to social justice, there might be a tendency to believe that actively building transformative projects is unnecessary. Essentialist views attributing a universal commitment to transformation to the entire CSM generation may contribute to power inequalities in social justice projects also. This vision, as described by John Crowley, plays a role in boundary maintenance, creating distinction and separation, us and them, young versus old. Former CSM activists' certainty about the generation's transformative capacity suggests the potential for internal and external boundaries. Interviews indicate a perception that older are conservative groups, older are traditional groups, that they don't want change. Identity narratives, according to Martin, can lead to the devaluation and even hostility towards the other. The collective identity narrative centered on transformations construct another, simplifying its position. Despite aiming for change, such a generational-focused narrative may isolate individuals from engaging with these transformative projects. Finally, attributing a moral sense to the vision of transformation centered on age limits understanding social transformation and its consequences. While generational perspectives offer insights, an excessive focus oversimplifies the dynamics of social change. Gramsci connected the generational question to class, emphasizing its relevance in political and social disputes. Giardo and Lecardian-Feixa has noted in different articles that the generational conflicts tend to be magnified for political reasons, as this helps to conceal the more contentious issues that people is looking to change. An exclusive focus on the generational dimension risks overlooking diverse social conflicts addressed by the CSM. These conflicts span class, geography, gender, and youth experiences. Thus, constructing a generational consciousness using the vision of transformation risks neglecting problems and needs of different social groups, undermining social justice projects. In this case, based on my discussion of the social positions of former system activists, may end up forefronting exclusively the interests of professional urban young people, in contrast with the rest of the population facing Chilean neoliberalism. As such, the porosity of the project of social transformation to integrate new perspectives in the future is key. The early 21st century witnessed global social mobilizations, with student movements being one of the most important. These movements, characterized by social justice ideas and facilitated by new technologies, present challenges for movement literature. My research aims to offer a theoretical and methodological approach to address these challenges. Particularly for this presentation, the generational dynamics exemplified by the Chilean student movement reveal that the sustained transformative vision over time can be carried, but also underscore tensions in projects arising from its massiveness and heterogeneity. And that's all. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pablo. That was really very interesting talk, I think, really interesting to hear about the tactical value of this generational discourse and also the really strong theoretical limits and praxis limits of how it works. The obvious parallels in some ways with South African colleagues here, for South African colleagues here, maybe. I'm sure there's a lot to talk about here. Thank you so much for that really thought-provoking contribution. Anybody like to start off? Jill is clapping here. Anybody like to start off with the comments or questions to Pablo? Not too many of us, so we can just come off mic, I think, and do that. Molly, you want to say something? Hi.
Yeah, well, because I'm going to have to hop out for a minute, but then I'll come back in. So just to ask, I mean, but that's a wonderful presentation. I got really excited. I think you have lots of really, really different kinds of data, and you're embedded in different ways. So I had two different questions, and neither is too riveting. I'd like to be here for the discussion, actually. The first is how you presented yourself. Okay, how did you, what was your sort of explicit or not explicit positioning in that? And did you think, that sort of influenced things that could and couldn't be said? And the other one, sorry, really pedantic, but as you will know really well, and you've done a really great job sort of indicating different kinds of literature, but there's a lot of debate on what the term generation actually means. And I wondered if you wouldn't mind just saying, just really briefly, what your working idea of that is. And again, I'm going to have to apologize because I'm going to have to go in just like 2 minutes. So sorry.
Yeah. So yeah, how I presented myself to the interviews, that is the question. Yeah. So basically I connect them through phone. Some of them knew my story, so it was people that met me from university, and others were new that were contacted thanks to my first connections. I tried to avoid this first like connection of people closer to me in order to understand, particularly this idea of how they bring the former CSM activists to their life stories. Yeah. So things that I try to control based on this challenge. The first one was trying to avoid the idea that I was contacting them because they were former activists. Basically, I contacted them because they were teachers aiming to do transformations. And so that was the first strategy. The second one was trying to be, during the live stories, just at the end of the third session, I aim to look and I ask them directly about the CSM experience. So basically, I try to have the sessions really open about educational transformation, and in their stories of educational transformation, how they bring their experience of the CSM. So trying to avoid, but at the same time, in any kind of narrative research and ethnographic research, the narratives that we build are shared by the researcher, I think, and the people that you're working with. It's not something like I can detach myself of what they answer me. But those were things that I tried to do in order to not push for the idea that the experience of the CSM must be in the interviews. Yeah. So, and so basically I try to reduce the information about myself, present myself as a researcher, as a teacher, but at the same time, because I did an at-home ethnography, some of them knew me from my background as activist, basically. And about generation, I think that is like a really interesting point, because first of all, in the conversation about generation, you have a strong difference between the English tradition or in English tradition of generation. I realize that I'm much more related with the idea of cohorts of these groups. I will say that in Spanish, in Latin America, and in Spain, the Hispano-American tradition, if I can call it something like that, is much more related with the work of Mannheim and Ortega y Gasset. Those are like the really important. Ortega y Gasset, the idea of the 15 years that he was trying to aim, obviously was highly questioned, but because of that, there is a school in Spain that developed this idea more from Mannheim, the idea of generational units from specific groups operating. That is one area. That is the area of finding generations. But as I said at the beginning, I'm much more interested in the uses of the idea of generation. So basically, how is people using the concept of generation and with what consequences? So that was the aim of how I use it. Yeah, it's much more the circulation of the concept and what consequences and what practices are connected with that.
Excellent. Really interesting. Thanks.
Hi, thank you. I can see a hand up. Yoko, hi.
Thank you, Pablo. Was a very interesting presentation. Congratulations. My question is in the same line of the Professor Andrews. We know that nowadays in Chile, there is an interesting debate about the concept of generation, right? On the one hand, we have, sorry, this is a very Chilean academic debate, but on the one hand, we have the periodically interventions of Carlos Peña in one of the most famous newspapers of our country. But on the other hand, we have the recent book of Yanko Gonzalez that is a great book and it's very successful, right? And we can see the tradition of Ortega y Gasset on the one hand, but also the tradition of Carles Feixa that is another approach to the problem of generations in general. So I would like to know, how do you position yourself, your own research between these debates?
Yeah, I think my main goal is trying to, I think that I can create connections with Yanko Gonzalez and the rest of the, I mean, in Chile, you have a lot of researchers like Oscar Aguilera, Rodrigo Ganter, Sarsuri, a lot of people influenced by Feixa that at the same time is quite influenced by Mannheim. So Mannheim is the basis of that strength. In contrast, Carlos Peña, I mean, he tries to, I think that my main focus is trying to contest the idea of Carlos Peña. I think that, because I think that that kind of ideas, that kind of generalizations, of essentializations of the idea of a generation can be quite challenging and can be a menace, and a menace for political diagnosis at the same time. I say this as a politically committed researcher. Sometimes I'm worried that many of the political projects in Chile are based on generational aspects. So basically, there are different groups using the concept of generation. So for that reason, I'm so interested in these findings and how the concept of generation is used to try to ask ourselves what other kind of things are operating behind the idea of generation. For instance, in the case of Francisco, it's something that I didn't discuss in the presentation, but in many ways, the idea of my generation are friends that at the same time come from the same militant group. So he's speaking about generation, but it's a specific discipline organization entering to the teachers' movement. You have, and the others, you have all these political projects like the Frente Amplio that created this new versus old. And to what extent those ideas of new versus old end up undermining the core ideas of transformations that you want to look. I mean, you end up not claiming any kind of specific change. So I think it's related with Yanko Gonzalez, with that critique to the Ortega y Gasset biological idea of the 15 years of cohorts. But at the same time moves a little bit more in historical. I think that there are really interesting books about the history of political parties, for instance, in Chile, or movements that try to ask how people use the idea of generation in order to gain a particular position in power or in politics. And I think something like that is really interesting in what is happening right now in Chile.
Really interesting, thank you. I'm sure that happens in other national contexts too. It's really interesting to hear you discuss that. Jill wants to come in here.
Thanks, Corinne. Yeah, a wonderful talk. Thanks so much, Pablo. I wanted to ask you if you would talk a little bit more about the movement in terms of roles. So it is a generational kind of movement, but it's also a movement in terms of roles and I think possibly class positionality of students who become teachers. That's really interesting to me. And what that does in terms of what's possible to do. So there is, I suppose, a kind of like sense that students are they're supposed to protest. It's kind of like a very important kind of element of the young kind of driving something forward with a vision for the future. That happens in universities as a kind of like but for teachers who are in classrooms, responsible for children, accountable, I'm assuming in your context, I'm not sure, but possibly to the state, and also, of course, to parents, and how they manage that kind of position. And I suppose related to that, I'm also interested in the ways in which the Chilean movement has managed to challenge what's happening in our context, an effective privatization of public institutions, both of schools and universities. So when you talk about the neoliberal kind of move, that's partly in terms of individual social mobility, that education provides that and then co-opts people into the system. But it's also in terms of the provision of education that is increasingly privatized, and what that does in terms of who is able to access what kinds of education. So it's kind of two questions bundled together, but I'd really like to hear your thoughts on those things. Thanks.
Yeah. About the Chilean student movement, it's something that is interesting because I will say that the first research on the student movement focused specifically in years. So you have research exploring the 2006, and others research exploring the 2011. But now that we have this certain space from the movement, I'm claiming the idea of a cycle. And in that cycle, you can find that the different ways of student movements are different at the same time in their compositions and in the centrality. For instance, I think that there are three main differences. I think that the 2006 was a movement that was led by secondary students, particularly from public education. In a segregated educational system like Chile, it was a student that the massive movement was particularly from working class backgrounds, but at the same time, the elites of the movement always come from specific places in Santiago. In the 2011, obviously, you have a difference that because of it was from higher education students, you have that there are critiques from instance, from people. I mean, there are some researchers saying that in a certain way, the main goals of social inequality and change were co-opted by other kind of left elites during 2011. So this 2006, much more working class base, in 2011 was co-opted by the typical political left elites in Latin America. So some people saying that. I don't think that that is the case, but there is that critique in order to understand the heterogeneity of the movement. In the case of privatization, I think there is something interesting. That is that the movement developed tools. They were able to sustain pressure on governments. So basically, they develop an agenda that after the 2011, the student movement aimed to control the policy consequences of the movement. Yeah, it's highly well known that many political parties and governments claim that they are answering the demands of the student movements, but of social movements in general, but without following the guidelines of the social movement. So for that reason, they try to continue mobilize. And there is also the political strategy that many of the student collectives became political parties. I mean, you already have in 2014 a small political collective entering in the government, in a center-left government, from Michelle Bachelet. So basically, they had something to say when the different laws, like the inclusion law, that end up the selection of students, that was something normal in Chile, was created. But on the long term, it's possible to say that the policy consequences were much more related with privatization also. I mean, they were able to capture the frames of inequality, but designing tools for increasing new accountabilities and but at the same time it's mixed because you have other elements like stopping segregation and the increase in funding. But the structure of privatization didn't change, if that is a question. And that connects a lot with the ways of things that these former activists do in schools, because I think it's strongly related with a concept that comes from social movement studies that is called biographical availability. That is how your life is shaped in a certain way that allows you to participate in a social movement. I think that concept is also useful to understand this transformative path or trajectories, because there is marriage, having a child, what kind of spaces you are taking part. Is not the same the things that teachers working in public education do and organize that teachers that do in private schools, for instance. Even though that they are speaking about transforming education, inequality, and democracy, and social justice, but they are doing different things. And for me, at least, it's really interesting the concept by the work by Sarah Ahmed and this idea of institutional plumbers. So basically, in many ways, you can, I mean, one of the questions that I have in my research is to what extent people entering and these former activists aiming to transform education within institutions are able to foster social justice, or to what extent they are becoming co-opted and tokenized as a way of looking transformative. So that is much more, that is really difficult to define. I'm not trying to fall in binaries also, but I think it's something to think about transformations and the kind of consequences that these massive and heterogeneous movements have.
Thank you, very useful. Nico is gonna intervene now, I think, hopefully. Hi, Nico.
Yeah, hello, can you hear me? Okay, so building from that, I was thinking about this idea of individual identity. You mentioned how there was this collective identification, but also sort of individual, referring like I am from that generation. I participate in that movement. So I was wondering, and also related to what you were just saying about these biographical dispositions and how teachers might be tokenized, I think, by the institutions. So which are the other uses that this identification, this individual identification, in this case from the teachers, are being displayed in their institutions? I mean, how they are, because I mean, I'm thinking in these institutional educational projects that each school have in Chile, like in which they describe the teacher profile, the teacher that they want to be working in their school. So when you mentioned this idea of we come from a generation that shake things, we come from a transformative generation, might these participants of yours been displaying this identity, this identification with this bigger movement, which is well seen in Chile? Maybe they be capitalizing in their institution as well. I mean, they might be tokenized, as you say, by the schools. I mean, we have these teachers to look transformative, but themselves, they are obtaining something as well, right? I mean, they are keeping the job.
I mean, that's a really interesting thing, because there are different trajectories. Because yeah, in some cases, for instance, the people working in public institutions, working in teachers' unions, they forefront the idea of being a former system activist. Because at the same time, it's a glimpse that they have a certain kind of political skill. Yeah, so it will be good to have them in the teachers' union. In the contrast, you have teachers that recognize but has negative consequences. For instance, I follow teachers in schools in contexts that were quite conservative, evangelical, and these teachers committed to social justice are seen as red teachers, and they pressure schools to take out of the schools to these teachers. I think that there are many trajectories. I think that is one of the challenges of my project, trying to find some basic categories to speak when you have so different trajectories.
Exactly, yeah.
There are other things, there are other trajectories that are much more strategic. And at the same time, they use those things that they consider that the movement gave them to navigate within the institutions, but in a way that allows them to preserve their jobs, for instance, or even to be distinctive in their jobs, because they are, and at the same time, use the spaces of institutions to develop their own agenda. That is really interesting, because a lot of things happening in Chile related with the citizenship education law, the law of inclusion, the law of diversity, there are not clear guidelines for teachers. But these teachers have much more experience on those areas, so they become committed and they are able to develop those guidelines in their own terms.
Yeah, I see. Thank you.
Thank you. Anybody who hasn't yet contributed, like to come in on this? It'd be nice to hear from others what they think of this debate. Actually, many people have contributed, but not everybody. Yeah. So maybe I can just ask you then, I wanted to refer to the work of somebody else who's not here, another Chilean who's just recently finished her PhD, Barbara Foster Tajeras, I think, who was working in a school south of Santiago, a quite progressive school with a long history, although I think private, but very socioeconomically not even diverse, but operating with the lowest level of socioeconomic privilege in the city, and had a cohort of teachers from this generation and then younger teachers. And those teachers from this so-called generation really asserted a lot of power within the school in terms of providing, she found, in terms of providing progressive education that subverted the utilitarianism of citizenship education. I think there was some kind of citizenship education that was basically a neoliberal kind of scam, and the progressive teachers with that history claimed that authority to subvert it. But in that case, then the younger teachers did not have that. You know, they could not say, even though they may have had the exact same political positions, and they may have had a family history of this or so on, and they may have had a stronger relationship to working class Chileans than those other teachers. They were not able to practice in the same way because of this generational grip that the movement had on practice in the school. I mean, that's my kind of take on it. I don't know if you think that kind of thing does happen.
Yeah, I think it's really important. I think that is the questions of my positionality, by why I asking myself this kind of things. I think that, I mean, I remember the presentation that Barbara did from this study, and I think that obviously, I mean, that is a specific context when you can see these different narratives of transformation in play, because there was like a space for that. I was much more interested in how they enter in this in these institutional educations that are much more rigid, and they aim to foster a much more commodified idea of education or that kind of curriculum. But yeah, I think that one of the, and connected with your point about these differences between teachers and generational experiences, I think that is one of the things that it worries me. I mean, I think that a lot of people from the student movement develop a discourse about generation, a narrative about generation, in order to gain, to be able to say something, to have power, to be able to contest the lack of transformations in Chile. But now those spaces are being in many ways controlled by this generation. So basically, how you start to speak with the others, that is the problem for me. And for that reason, Molly wrote, I remember that Molly book, and I can't remember the name, but in 2005, when you discussed this idea of ageism, or what happened with Brexit. I mean, here my positionality is this group of people that was part of student movements, that were part of universities, what kind of project are creating, and what kind of people are alienating for those projects, and what kind of new hierarchies are creating. I mean, and because I'm worried of that project of social transformation. It's not, I mean, sometimes I think if these kind of ideas are too critical of the idea, because, I mean, at the same time, it's really interesting to find out that for people, it's still relevant, the Chilean student movement, that they say that this is fueling transformations. That is really important. And I think it's a finding. But what it worries me more is how this produce new hierarchies and identities that are fixed again, rather than being porous. And I think those kind of hierarchies are happening right now in the schools. And what happened when someone with a framework of social justice has a hierarchy and has power and try to control the rest, people reveal. And I think that in Latin America, a lot of people contesting ideas of social justice is because of that, because these people is arriving, using power, and not trying to include them, but impose in the same way. So, and that creates much more menaces because, and I always use the same example of Argentina. The idea of the president that came to power in Argentina was change, was transformation. The ultra-liberalization of Argentina was change and transformation. And that happened with elites that are claiming social justice are not developing in a way that is not hierarchical, I think. And that for that reason, the concept is so interesting for me, and the uses.
I think there's a question, an additional question from Molly in the chat. If you want to take a look, or Molly, maybe just raise it.
Yeah, well, I didn't want to, I mean, since I already got to ask a question, I didn't want to hog the time here. But and your work just invites so many other questions. But it's, yeah, I just said, I wondered if you had shared any of your provisional findings with your participants, and what kind of reactions they had. And I also wondered how much similarity you felt there was across the sort of self-definitions of people as activists come teachers. I mean, did you sort of feel that there was a, you know, tendency towards homogeneity, or was there a real contrast there? And how do you deal with that?
Yeah. I think that regarding your first question, I have a conversation about the interviews, the live stories. So we have that conversation. I haven't yet had this conversation about the connections between the live stories and the participant observations. About the live stories was really interesting because this created conversations, because at the same time because of age, because of experiences, I was already open to the idea that, I mean, I opened the idea that I was an activist or a former activist, etc. So basically, it was a horizontal conversation about how things are going and how things are developing. I think that in many ways, they try to tell me more about the connections with the CSM in those interviews. Like they were trying to give me more narratives for my research. That was the main, I mean, but I remember now other things. But I was trying to, so that they were trying to give me more. And I think it's connected because during the time of the interview, there was all the political campaign, and so there was this idea of former CSM activists circulated, because the president and the first line of minister came from the Chilean student movement. So there was an openness to that. Regarding the second question, I think that there is something I realized in the participant observations. So in the visions, I found that everything was heterogeneous. There were ideas really floating ideas connected to democracy and to inequality. Those were the core ideas of visions. and that was really good because in a certain way echoes the frames of the Chilean student. The frames of the Chilean student movement were democratization of education and inequality. The thing is that when I arrived to participate, when I arrived to a school, I realized that these teachers were those teachers trying to do things differently. They were connected with social justice agendas in the really open idea of social justice. But when I went to the specific practices is where I start to find the differences. And that is what it worries me, because if you develop a social justice agenda, but your pedagogy is not democratic, you'd end up transforming a social justice in another math lesson or science lessons. So yeah, but I think those two frames are really important, and all this grows by the idea of generation. I mean, I was thinking, I come from a background in history. I was thinking in Benedict Arneson idea of imagined community. I think that generation, it's like an imagined community also operating in schools.
Really interesting. Thank you.
We've kind of reached the end point of the time, Pablo. Thank you so much for all this.
Thank you for the time and for
Really.
your interest.
No, it's been a great discussion. Do you want to now ask the people here about your
Yes.
other idea?
I'm calling for a collective of doctoral students aiming to put in practice or trying to work together in our analysis of narratives. So basically, I'm trying to organize a workshop, and I'm starting to call for people. My idea is to create, at least this is my idea at the beginning, a day of 2 workshops, and trying to look for really smart and experienced people in narrative research, guiding those workshops when we can put our hands and try to work with data, and at the third time work with our experiences and the experience of the rest of the people. So I think that at the same time, because I'm so worried about generation, I think that I have to foster these intergenerational dialogues regarding research. And I think that, so basically I'm calling for all people interested in narrative research. I'm thinking this doing face-to-face in London. I think that, so basically I'm starting to call people. Yeah, so I will write an email, send you to Corinne in order to start to create a group. I think that if I can reach 10 people to start a workshop, and if I can ask for help from Molly, Corinne, to develop those workshops, it will be great.
Happy to help with that. And if you want to book rooms or something, but I think you can probably do that yourself. But let's see. But also, can I say, from doing this quite often before, I think that it's very helpful to be led yourselves by yourselves.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that somebody else should be there, I mean, intergenerationally or not, you can, this is not work that needs hierarchy.
Yeah, exactly. I'm aiming for something like that. It's much more, but at the same time, because of the experience, I mean, some of the questions, for instance, that you or Molly made about how I approached to the interviews, how I did the narrative analysis, how I present myself, all those questions, I think that are questions that for people that is starting in narrative research are really important to have clear and how to approach. Perhaps I'm at the end, so basically am I analyzing, but at the same time, this might be really helpful for people starting. Yeah, when the only thing that you have is that you're looking for stories. So perhaps we can have this conversation. What is a story? Why we spoke about stories and not discourses, and all that's conversations that I think that are really important.
I think you might get more than 10 people, in fact, Pablo. But yeah, that would be great. And somebody, Ovidio, who is in Romania, is expressing interest, but that will be in person, I think. So maybe we need to do an online version as well.
Yeah, but we can record and do something cool.
So of course we can do that. Okay. So, well, thank you. We can see Nico is interested, and hopefully many other people.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so we'll make a recording of this and put it on YouTube for those colleagues of yours who weren't able to be here. But in the meantime, thank you so much. That was a really productive and engrossing session, I think.
Thank you, Corinne.
Thanks so much, Pablo.
Thanks, Pablo.
Thank you. That was great.
Yeah.
Yes. Bye-bye, everyone.
Good night, everyone. Bye.
Thank you, Pablo.